I'm sorry you weren't expecting me, but Dave Chesmore. Dave Chesmore I know very well, and it's a pity he can't be here because he's a fantastic expert in electronics, and his research involves looking at the sounds insects make, particularly insects that can't be seen, insects under bark, insects in wood, and he does a lot of work for the Forestry Commission, particularly looking for pest beetle larvae under the bark and in the wood of trees. He started his research on grasshoppers, and what he was measuring was the stridulation noises that grasshoppers make, and what he can do is identify individual species from the specific sounds, the specific stridulation noises they make. And in fact, back in 2005, 2006, one or the other, I was at York University talking with him about devising electronic apparatus to look at the stridulation noises that stag beetle larvae make. And that has come about. My colleague and I at Royal Holloway University in London now have that apparatus and can look at the waves on the computer that you can see from the stridulation noises that stag beetle larvae make. They actually make quite a loud noise, so that when I've got them in small containers, because I'm measuring their growth, if I disturb the box they're in, they stridulate and you can hear it with your ear. You don't need a little microphone to hear it. So, without more ado, I'm standing in for Dave. And I'm going to talk about the flight capacity and dispersal of the stag beetle. Back in 2006, after a number of trials, I did a mark release recapture experiment in one private garden, which you'll see on screen in a moment, to see how far they went, or try and see how far they went, and whether they stayed in the same vicinity. And I went on from there to do 3 years of radio tracking with transmitters that I bought through finance from what was English Nature, now Natural England. And then from there, I continued with the research to find out how far they can actually fly in tethered flight experiments. Is this going to work? Nothing happening? Yes. There's the male, for those of you who don't know, the male stag beetle, with the very large antlers, very distinctive beetle, and it's now a flagship species for invertebrate conservation. It's an endangered species. It occurs across Europe, right as far as into Russia, but in a very narrow band within a particular temperature range. It's fully protected in Europe by law, not protected at all in Britain, and we're fighting to get it protected. It's a priority species in the Biodiversity Action Plan, and so a lot of research is now taking place, particularly in Europe, so across Germany, France, Poland, right across Europe. Research has started and papers are starting to be published. The first people to start researching were myself and Dr. Deborah Harvey at Royal Holloway. The female has much smaller jaws. It has jaws which are extremely sharp pointed, and if you put your finger between those, you know all about it. She will draw blood, whereas the male, although he can use his jaws for gripping, he can't really puncture the skin. I'll say a little bit about the life cycle of the beetle first, before I go on to the various experiments. There's a larva. They're great big things, as big as your middle finger when they're full grown. They're subterranean. They feed on decaying wood under the ground, on old tree stumps, living trees, which have got dead parts under the ground, logs that are lying on the ground. The larvae might be in the ground and feeding on the underside of the logs. Even in strange places like wood chip piles, feeding on the bottom of those. The strangest one I had was a pile of cat litter that had been thrown out year after year after year, and the stag beetle larvae were feeding on the bottom of that. What do they feed on in the way of tree species? They're pretty eclectic, catholic in taste. They'll feed on any deciduous wood, but very rarely on conifer. And we think the reason for that is the sticky nature of the resin in the conifer. I've had a couple or 3 records of stag beetle larvae from very dried out, very old conifer wood, one being cedar, the other being a pine, but no resin left in it. As far as length of lifespan is concerned, these things sometimes take 6 years to get to full size from an egg that's about 3 millimeters across. Feeding on this very poor nutritive material, this rotting wood, which has got so little nitrogen in it, it provides not enough for building protein over a very short period, so they have to stay in the wood quite a long time. They pupate underground. They make a cocoon of whatever's around them, little wood particles, soil particles, sometimes little stones even are mixed in with it. About the size of a duck egg, about a centimetre in thickness. So think of an egg with a centimetre thick shell. And inside that, round about the end of September, they pupate. So after 6 years' growth, underground, feeding on dead wood, they pupate underground in this cocoon they build. And in that cocoon, they stay for about 6 weeks as a pupa and then turn into an adult. But the adult stays in the cocoon until the following spring, provided we get a spring, at least a warm spring. And then they emerge from the ground anywhere between mid-May onwards, depending upon the weather. They need warm weather. And warm weather, particularly in the evening. I always say, and SNS members will have heard this before, that you need to be sitting outside at the pub on a warm evening in your shirt sleeves. Then you might see stag beetles. Otherwise, they're hiding away. It's too cool for them. They're a thermophilic species. They need lots of warmth. When they do emerge from underground, they use either the jaws of the female or the antlers, the large jaws of the male, to push their way out of the ground. And here is an emergence hole. They're typically D-shaped, about the width of a stag beetle, which is possibly 1.5 centimetres or just over. So you've got the flat side, underside of the body forming the flat side of the D, and the rounded elytra side of the beetle forming the rounded side of the hole. And usually a little pile of soil that they pushed out at the side, which you can see at the top of the screen there. You can't see it very well on the screen there, but just 8 millimeters below the surface, there was a male sitting, waiting to emerge. This was about 8:30 in the evening. And anywhere between 8:30 and 9:30, 9:45 at night, at dusk, provided the weather is warm, they emerge. And then the males will fly, searching for females to mate with. The females tend not to fly. They search about on the ground for good egg-laying places in dead wood whilst the males are searching for them. Once they've found a good place, they'll stick around and they'll give off sex pheromones to attract the males down to the ground. So the males are flying about, waiting for the wafting pheromones to come up. And then they will come down and mate with the females. And mating can take place over quite a long period. It might be over 24 hours that the two stay together. I haven't been sitting outside watching this, by the way. I've had them in tanks at homes and monitored how long that they stay together. So there's been a lot of field work and a lot of lab work that's gone into this. This was in one garden about two doors away from me, where on one particular evening at an old sycamore stump, 63 beetles emerged from holes like this, all the way around the stump, and they were emerging from the roots, not the stump itself. So the spread of the roots out from the stump had fed the larvae, and then they're pupated out by the roots, and then the stag beetles emerged from there. This garden, about 400 yards from me in Bentley, is the garden that I did the mark release recapture experiments in and the first year of radio tracking in. Groups of stag beetles emerge from this garden every year, and you'll see why. The garden is Grove Lodge Garden up at that right-hand corner, and you can see where the bungalow is. The dotted line represents 2 lines of lime trees that once were there. Been cut down. There are 2 trees left out on the dotted lines that you can see, and 2 very large stumps in the garden that you can see I've drawn as circles, A and B. A and B up the top there. Don't worry about C and D. And the stag beetles were emerging from these stumps and from underneath a pile of logs in the garden from a sycamore tree that had been cut down from the garden itself at point C there. The curved parallel lines are a very narrow sea road going round the corner where the bungalow is. Here was one of the piles of sycamore logs in the garden, and every year if I rolled that front log forwards towards me, there were larvae that had been chewing on the bottom of it, and the larval heads could be seen in the holes underneath. I'll come back to those logs. With the mark release experiment, I devised a coding system for the underside of the beetle and simply used one of these fine Tipex pens to put Tipex marks underneath because on top predators can see them easily and pick the beetles out more easily. So I could have, if you like, beetle number 1 at the top there on the right. I could have beetle 22, 2 across left to right, or I can have 1,666 if I got that far. So I could have a huge range of beetles. As it happened, I captured 138 beetles, I think it was, in the garden, marked and released them. This is when I rolled the log back during the stag beetle season, and there were lots of males underneath that front log. I don't know how many you can see there. There were 6 in the picture that I took originally. And that's what they do during the daytime. They hide away under logs, sometimes dig into the ground to hide themselves, but very rarely. They usually hide under things. People who keep flower pots in the garden, they're sometimes under those, or any plant container to keep out of the way of predators. And there's a beetle that's been marked. I can't remember the number of that one off the top of my head without looking. You probably can work it out for yourselves. I have it written down somewhere, but coming out very quickly this morning, I've forgotten half my notes. But you can see that you can mark individual beetles and recognize them quite easily. Any beetles where the marks disappeared for one reason or another were not counted in the survey. So if I picked up a beetle and it had got just a couple of marks left or 1 mark left, then I didn't count it in the survey. I always put, I don't think it shows in these slides, I always put a mark in the middle of the head so that if there was only the head left, because predators often eat the soft parts and distribute the rest of the body all around the place, at least I'd know that was a beetle that was marked. And then at the end of the experiment, I was right, 138. 138 beetles were captured, and 52 of those were recaptured out of the 138. And out of the 138, 100 were males that were captured and 38 were females. And you can see the percentage of each that were recaptured. Why were more males recaptured? They're much easier to find. They fly, you can capture them with a butterfly net, which I did if they were flying. Or you can lift up logs if they're hiding away. They're much easier to see. The females tend to hide away in very difficult places to find, and you tend to find far fewer of them, but still a reasonable percentage were found to work out whether this was a method worth using in the future. The other site where work was done, and this was done with the radio transmitters, which I'll come to in a moment, was at a wood surgeon's woodyard where he stored his logs, but also cut the logs up inside the woodyard. We've got a narrow sea road running down towards the right, a line of trees along the road which once was a hedge, and then on your right, which you can't see in the picture, is a farm, field of cows in the distance to the right, and then behind these piles of logs inside the woodyard, you've got further piles that you can see, but the important bit is the wood chip on the floor of the woodyard, and it's in this there were hundreds of larvae. So I was collecting larvae from here for my growth experiments, and then when they pupated, came to adulthood, I took them back to the woodyard. The logs that were cut up were of all sorts of species of tree, ranging from oak, which you all know, through to eucalyptus. There was a whole mix of stuff in there. Now, the mark release recapture and the radio tracking requires a huge effort of field work. That means going out every night and every morning for the mark release, right through the season, and the radio tracking 3 times a day. But that's over a shorter period because the batteries in the radio transmitters that we used last a maximum of about 21 days. So a very short period compared to the mark release experiments. There's a male beetle with a transmitter on. The first transmitters I used were bought from Australia. They hadn't, in this country, got small enough ones at the time. And these weighed roughly 0.5 of a gram, just under 0.5 of a gram, rather heavier than what you can get nowadays. But the important thing was that the beetles could fly with them on. So it may seem strange, but I took beetles to my village hall, which was newly built, which has lighting control that I can dim, so I can make it dusk, and heating control, so I could get the temperature right. But even so, the beetles would only fly at the normal time they fly. So I took beetles there, experimented. I already got transmitters stuck on at home. They're stuck on by super glue, by the way, which is very effective. All you do is just rub the surface of the thorax with a little bit of sandpaper, just because it's very shiny and smooth, and a dab of super glue on that, pop the transmitter on, and away you go. They don't interfere at all with the flight, as long as you get the antenna directly in line with the gap between the two elytra, the two wing cases. You know, if it's to one side, they can't open their wings properly. So there was a lot of fiddling about. Each transmitter is, if you like, electronically tuned to one particular frequency. They each have their own frequency. These are hand-built. That's why they're so expensive. And you can ask the company for specific frequencies. In this country, I think it's on 173. You have to stick to the 173 band. And then you go 173.1, 0.2, 0.21, and so on to get the transmitters, so you can detect individual beetles quite easily. And there's the female. These were bought from BioTrack in this country, down in the south, and these weigh far less. I think these were somewhere around, if my memory serves me correctly, somewhere around 0.2. Sorry, somewhere around, yes, 0.2. They now make transmitters much smaller than that, much less weight than that. It just depends how far the development had gone at that particular point as to what you could buy. Incidentally, these little tags, as they call them, cost about £120 each. And since I was using just over 30 of them, you can imagine how much it cost, hence the grant from English Nature. Plus the television aerial type detector and the receiver and a wand antenna, because when you're looking for these things, you might find which direction there is, and they're about here, but are they up there, up a tree, or are they under the ground? So you've got a little wand that you can, oh yes, it's down there, under that log, or even under the ground, or it's gone up that tree. With the radio telemetry, obviously, I mean, both with the mark release recapture, you weigh the beetles, see what mass they've got. Otherwise, if the beetle's very small, it won't carry the transmitter. So you need beetles which are big enough. I measured the length of them, transmitter mass, just to make sure they'd sent me transmitters that would be within the range. These were some of the first transmitters from Australia. And then transmitter mass to body mass to give you what percentage weight they're carrying. So I forget what was said earlier, but some of them are quite big. Here, what was the smallest? 8.2% of its body weight, up to 14. So they could carry them quite easily at those weights. Those were the frequencies of those particular transmitters. Males at the top, females down the bottom here. And over on the right, those that flew with an F and didn't fly with an NF. What I wasn't doing there was, on that particular table, was putting in how far they flew. It may not show up in this slide, but up there on the oak tree there's a beetle, and at this point I should say that male beetles tend to go up. And the reason is we think they're so heavy they don't take off very easily from the ground. They need height to sort of drop away from the tree and then open their wings and flap like mad. So it's up on the right of the tree, about just over halfway up the screen. Radio tracking, yes, doesn't show up very well in this particular light, but the garden I showed you earlier, before I showed you the wood yard, the bungalow is on the right there. The yellow lines are where males, the maximum distance males flew to, and the red line going from that point where the two males started, coming down and round the bungalow and then up slightly. That was the longest distance a female walked. She didn't fly, and she buried herself in the vegetable patch where there's lots of compost. And I have found larvae in people's gardens in the compost that's been dug into the garden. So that's what she was after. Lots of the other beetles went shorter distances, but they aren't on this particular slide. The farm that I talked about earlier, opposite the woodyard, that's Mace Green Farm there. The woodyard is this side of it. and it's the sort of brownish patch in between this large arable field here and the farmhouse, that sort of small patch that you can see in the middle there. There it is enlarged. So there's the arable field, farmhouse is over there, and the wood yard, bounded by the tree line, that side of it, and a hedge, this side of it. That's the tree line with the yellow lines either side of it, and the hedge down this side. And what was interesting was when it was windy nights, very windy, they wouldn't fly at all. When there was wind blowing on the tree line side, all the beetles flew on the inside of the wood yard, up and down the tree line on the inside. And when the wind was in the opposite direction, across the wood yard, they were all flying on the roadside, up and down the road. Wind does affect them quite seriously. They're very heavy, clumsy beetles. If you've seen them flying, they seem to have no direction at all. They'll just bump into things and then fall to the ground. One particular male, and I concentrated on this one because it's the one that went the furthest, started off in the wood yard at number 1, flew across the road into the, almost at the back of the farmhouse, along a hedge line there, which you can't see very clearly, via a bush, a shrub about that high, in the front garden. So it flew across the road into this bush, rested. I can't remember whether it was a couple of days or a day, but it stayed there. Then it moved to behind the farmyard into the hedge line, moved along the hedge line, climbing trees, which I can't show on this slide, down the trees again, further along the hedge line. Then it came back in the same way, came across the lane that leads down behind the farmhouse, went up an oak tree like the beetle you saw in a previous slide, stayed up that tree for some time, flew across the road, or may have crawled, I don't know, it's difficult to tell, across the road to another oak tree that stood the other side of that track, up the tree, and it stayed there. Then it came right across to the tree line on the far side of the road, again, went up the tree. Then it went down the road to another tree, and then back into the wood yard to almost the same place it started. I can only think that it couldn't find a female anywhere over there and came back again. And it ended up eventually at number 11. Now, in terms of dispersal distance, that's not very far from 1 to 11. So it might have gone a long way, but it hasn't gone very far in terms of dispersal distance. The female, which doesn't show up as clearly with that red line there, that's the furthest the female went, from one side of the wood yard to the other, where she dug down, and presumably I didn't disturb her, laid her egg somewhere down there under the wood chip. Other females moved about, but they tended to move along the log piles, backwards and forwards, obviously seeking a suitable place in which to lay eggs. Beetles that didn't have transmitters on, when I was watching, flew, and those are the furthest distances they flew, and they flew out across the arable, or towards the edge of the arable field. The one on the far right landed in a tree at the end of that hedge line, and then came back again. The one out into the arable field came back, and so did the one that went out into, the cows aren't in the field at the moment, but sometimes cows are in that field, and came back again. So I thought, well, they don't disperse very far, which is what we thought, watching them in the field without doing any experiments, they seem not to go very far. In over 20 years of watching them, I've only seen a female fly 4 times, whereas every night during the season I can see males. Females don't fly very often. The radio tracking showed that as well, only a small amount of flight, 3 out of all of them. So I thought, well, how far can they fly? And carried out some tethered flight experiments. This, a weird-looking piece of apparatus, is home-built. Piece of block ply at the bottom with a hole drilled in to house just a vertical cylindrical aluminium rod. And then the bar going across at the top is a flat piece of aluminium with holes drilled into it to make it light, equal number of holes each side. The lighter the better. It's attached to the top of the upright rod by an almost frictionless bearing. The little wooden platform you can see underneath that is there to hold the sensor so that every time the arm goes round, it can sense how many times it's gone round. And knowing the radius or the diameter of the arm, I can then calculate, or rather the instrument can calculate how far it's gone. And at the bottom there, attached to the sensor, is a simple, well, I say simple, it's one of the more elaborate bicycle mileometers, which will read off how far your bike has gone, how fast you've been going, and so on, and will even give you the means. So all I did, that just shows the thing slightly closer. Oh, I didn't point out that at the end of each arm, there are a pair of ordinary sewing needles superglued on with the sharp ends pointing outwards. Come back to those in a moment. Good instructions for that as to how to set it up. So the beetle was attached to one end of the arm by a piece of plastazote. It's the sort of stuff you line insect boxes with, fairly flexible. I needed it to be flexible so the arm could bend or swing when the stag beetle started to fly. I didn't want to have it rigid so it felt it was in the wrong position. And on the other side, a piece of blue tack. Weighed the beetle first, weighed some blue tack to equal the weight so it would balance out. Just plug the blue tack onto the end of the 2 needles. And then the plastazote 2 needles just went into the other end. I had a terrible job fixing the beetle to the plastazote. I tried everything until my son said, when I was down seeing him near Bath, he unfortunately, well, I say unfortunately, she's a lovely girl. She's totally deaf. She was born totally deaf and has 2 cochlear implants. It's her birthday yesterday. And we're going down to see her after the weekend. Anyway, to come back to this, what she used to use to hold the earpieces behind her ear is toupee tape, stuff you stick wigs on with. That was brilliant. Piece of that folded around the end of the plastazote with a little square piece. Stick it on the beetle. It was difficult to get it off. Okay. There's a male flying and a female just opening her wings. You can see the toupee tape just on the end of the plastazote there. And they flew round and round on the arm, and I had them flying for exactly 1 hour. That was the parameter, 1 hour. I allow you 1 hour, then I'm going to stop you. 50 beetles were used, 25 females, 25 males. I put it up like this because I can't remember the figures either from 2-3 years ago. All of the males flew but not all of them flew for the 60 minutes. So you can see there that 21 of them flew for the whole 60 minutes and 16, is that right? No, between 23 and 60 minutes. And 16 sustained it for the whole 60. Only 3 of the females would fly, and then they were very reluctant to fly. They didn't like their feet being off the ground, I don't think, which backed up what you see in the wild. They don't fly very often, they're crawling about. Obviously with flight mills, it's an artificial system, so you're not seeing exactly what might happen in the wild. But I was amazed at the speed they fly. Nearly 10 kilometers an hour for a male. And the males went with a mean of over 6 kilometers, so they can fly quite a distance if they have to. Females, less in distance. I suspect that might be something to do with carrying the eggs, but I'm not really sure. So long-distance dispersal may be possible, but doesn't usually happen in the wild. And then I compared the radio tracking that had been done in Switzerland. That was the first set of radio tracking data that was available. And then in Germany, and you can see the difference there is in my own tracking over 9 days. The total displacement by that male, going out, across, coming back was 225 meters, but the actual dispersal distance was quite small, only 50 meters, and the dispersal distance range very small. Very much greater in Germany, and the difference there, we think, is because their beetles are very much bigger. Same species, but there is variability. They've got great big heads and much bulkier beetles, and probably with lots more muscle. It has constraints, obviously. You can't compare it with what's going on in the field. It's possibly biased. The flight mill, by the way, was built but modified from a design by Glenn Dubois, who's now got his doctorate. He was working on Osmoderma, a beetle that lives in orchards in the wood pulp inside trees. Handling the beetle might have an effect. The mechanical characteristics of the flight mill might have an effect. But at least they provide a simple method for comparing the flight variability under these controlled conditions. Importantly, the conservation of the beetle, which I'll finish on, because the beetle in this country seems only to go very short distances, particularly where there's lots of dead wood present, or wood chip in the case of the woodyard, putting the question non-scientifically, why go very far when there's plenty of food where you are? We think that's why the dispersal distance is short. They exist in metapopulations, not in one big population, so you've got perhaps an isolated tree stump with a population of stag beetles, and then you haven't got one for miles. You might have a population like at that woodyard where there were hundreds, but it might be the only population there is in that whole village. So what we're after is building stepping stones in between places where we know they are, to give an opportunity for the beetles to move from one to the other, and maintaining a continuity of dead wood at places where you know the beetles are. Many people helped me along the way. English Nature is up there, Glenn Dubois is up there. Oh, the other one I couldn't remember was Titley Electronics in Australia, provided the first transmitters. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Colin, very much indeed for jumping in. How much notice did you get that you might be on?
7:30 this morning.
7:30 this morning. Excellent.